And this story begins with a historical fact from the scriptures for us that up until this point, even though it's been alluded that there would have to be something that would happen for God to be able to forgive mankind, it was alluded to in the Garden of Eden when God told Eve that your offspring will crush the head of the serpent. Great, we're going to have victory over sin. But until this point, we have no indication of how that is going to be possible. This is the only type in the whole Old Testament that points to a human sacrifice for sin. This is the only one. It's the only one that tells us that the lamb that will be offered will be a human lamb. Here it is in this story that God first reveals the necessity of a human victim to pay for human sin. Animal sacrifice does not satisfy the Creator's justice against the sin of humanity. Only another human who is spotless, sinless, innocent, can pay for the guilt of other humans. It is the only type that indicates human sacrifice. Secondly, I want you to notice the focus in this story on the relationship between the Father and the Son. Notice the focus on the Father-Son relationship. The very first thing we notice in this passage is that God says to Abraham, "Take your son, your only son." Now, we know that Abraham had another son by the wrong woman, and his name was Ishmael. And God declares right here that he was not a part of God's eternal redemptive purpose for mankind. He was not recognized by God as Abraham's only son or even as a son. Here God says, "Take your only son, the son of promise, the son that I gave you with barren Sarah, the son that I gave you when you were beyond the capacity to have a son of your own. I made it miraculously possible. You are the son of miraculous birth," he said about Isaac. Just as God has only one son who is not created, but has always been and always will be the eternal, pre-existent one, Jesus Christ, the only Son of God. And so God calls Abraham to focus in on this one relationship with his only son, and he tells us that the Father loved the Son. "Take your only son Isaac, whom you love." The love of the Father for his Son cannot be measured in human terms. It is infinite, beyond our capacity to understand. The love the Father has for you is beyond your capacity to understand and can only be understood through the example of God sacrificing his own Son that he loved so that he could have a relationship with you. That is the only way to begin to try to understand the love of God. Which of you as a father would sacrifice your own son? Whether he is your only son or one of multiple sons, which of you would sacrifice intentionally so that someone else might live, your son? You may have heard this story before, but from what we can understand from history, it's a true story of a man who was an operator of a lift bridge at a railroad crossing over a river. Huge gears that would drive this railroad bridge up and down so that boats could pass underneath or that trains could pass across when it was brought down. And one day his son, 8 years old, came to work with him. And as his son was playing and the lift bridge was up so boats could pass, he got notice that in 10 minutes a train was coming and he needed to lower the bridge. And at that moment his son slipped and fell into one of the gears and got caught. And the father frantically tried to get him out, frantically pulling and pulling, trying to get his son out, and he could not release him from the gears as the train approached. And the father said, "Do I sacrifice everyone on that train for the sake of saving my son, or do I sacrifice my son for those on the train?" And he pushed the button to lower the bridge, and his son was killed. Can you imagine doing that? Can you imagine how much love you have for your children, that you would make that sacrifice on behalf of others? And God says to Abraham, "Take your son, your only son, Isaac, the one whom you love, and give him up for me. Give him up for me." And the father gives up his son. In Romans 8:32, Paul tells us and refers back and says, "God spared not his own son so that we could have life." And God told Abraham, if you really trust me, if you trust my eternal purpose, if you trust everything that I have under my control, which is everything, if you trust what I'm going to do to make a great nation out of you, if you trust that so absolutely completely that you trust who I am, not your evaluation of what you think I'm going to do, but you've gone beyond the evaluation and you say, I trust you and you alone, God, you cannot fail. You made this promise. It cannot fail. I will give up my son. Could you do that? Abraham did. But there's another part of the relationship between the father and the son here that's symbolic and typical also. The son obeys the father. Isaac never fought the father's will. Isaac asked a question, "Where's the lamb?" He got an answer that helped him to have faith until his father bound him and picked him up and put him on all the wood and then raised the knife over him, and the son is going, "What?" Now, some people have asked, how old would Isaac have been at this point? The term here that's translated in your scriptures as either boy or young man can cover an age anywhere from about 8 to 12 years of age all the way up to 25 years of age. So Isaac could have been anywhere in there, but from the timeline of what's happening, he's probably in his early 20s at this time with all the capacity to fight off his dad and to change the outcome of this event. Just as Jesus, praying in the Garden of Gethsemane, had all the authority of heaven as eternal pre-existent God himself to change the course of what would happen. And he even prayed, "Father, if it's possible, take this cup from me." And yet he obeyed the Father's will to die, to see God's purpose accomplished. This father-son relationship is typical. It's a type of the relationship between God the Father and God the Son when they implemented the plan of redemption on the cross. Number 3, the Father set apart the Son for sacrifice. Another part of the typology is this: the Father set apart the Son for sacrifice. Look at verse 3. So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him and his son Isaac. And he cut the wood, and he grabbed the fire and the knife, and he made every intention to set his son apart for that sacrifice, because that's what God told him to do, and that's what the Father did with Jesus as well. Acts chapter 2, verse 23, the death of Jesus was according to the definite plan and foreknowledge of God. It was a plan to set Jesus apart. Acts 4, 27 and 28. For truly in this city there were gathered together against your holy servant Jesus, whom you anointed, both Herod and Pontius Pilate, along with the Gentiles and the peoples of Israel, to do whatever your hand and your plan had predestined to take place. God put a plan into place, and then he worked his plan to perfection. And Peter looks back on that in 1 Peter chapter 1 and said, he was foreknown, speaking about Jesus, he was foreknown before the foundation of the world, but was made manifest in the last times for the sake of you, who through him are believers in God, who raised him from the dead and gave him glory, so that your faith and hope are in God. He was foreknown before the world was even created. This is what God was going to do with his Son. And he implemented the plan just as Abraham did. Number 4, the sacrifice that would take place that day would be a transaction between the Father and the Son only. Look at verse 5. Abraham said to his young men, you don't get to go with me from here on. Stay here with the donkey. I and the boy will go over there and worship and come again to you. The sacrifice that day was going to be a transaction only between the Father and the Son, between Abraham and Isaac, as an act of worship. 2 men were left behind. They were witnesses of Isaac carrying the wood, and they were witnesses that there would be a sacrifice, but they were not allowed to see what transpired at the altar. How beautiful the typology of this, that there were 2 thieves on the cross. Witnesses that a sacrifice took place, but not witnesses to the eternal transaction that took place on the heavenly altar when Christ died. You see how beautiful the Scripture is? To lead us to the cross. In everything we read, it's all about Jesus. And there was a transaction that took place that day on the cross. But before that transaction could take place, some other things happened. The Son had to carry the burden of the wood. You all get that. Those of you that know the Scriptures, you all get that. The Son had to carry the cross. Isaac carried the burden of the wood. The Son was a willing participant in the sacrifice. He volunteered to take part in God's plan. And meanwhile, while the Son carried the wood, the Father carried the fire and the knife, because the fire and the knife were the instruments of justice. And God alone carries the instruments of justice against sin. And God used the instrument of justice, his wrath against sin, to put Jesus to death on the cross. While the Son carried the wood so that the sacrifice was possible, the Father instituted the justice